Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, the host of White House Chronicle. Thank you for coming along. No subject dominates conversations as constantly and as steadily, probably, as the one of immigration. Immigration is a global phenomenon, a global problem, but it is also very much a live issue in the United States. I have been interested and concerned with the fate of the 11 million, that's what we think the number is, of people who live here in the shadows, who are not counted, who are not legal, but who cannot leave and come back either, who work, have families, fall in love, make children, and yet live in this strange non-world of illegality, whatever you call it. A very forward-looking organization called the Immigrant Tax Inquiry Group out of Malibu, California, has been looking into the issue of immigration and taxation. And their approach is headed by a man called Mark Jason, who has poured his personal fortune into this work, is to look at the immigration not as a human problem, which is what I tend to look at it as, but as a tax challenge. And his organization has come up with a proposal of taxing the immigrant and taxing the employer, but giving the immigrant a work permit. We're going to hear about that in the next half hour, and we thank you for coming along. This program is recorded on the Capitol of the United States, and it is recorded here because we are covering a briefing, a special session organized by the Immigrant Tax Inquiry Group for the purpose of advising members of Congress, in particular their staffs, on this proposal.
Last night, as I was drafting some notes, what I was going to say this afternoon, I couldn't help but thinking about my childhood when I was living in the 40s and having the purge of the Jews in Eastern Europe, and the analogy of those that tried to give sanctuary to them, they met with serious consequences, and to the sanctuary cities today. Also, I wanted to mention briefly that there's massive tax fraud that's going on right now, which has actually led me to this study. What's really missing in immigration reform is a way to fund what's necessary. The complaints that we hear about crowded schools and crowded ER, these are all real concerns, and there is a way to address this. And that's the third way, or our 5+5 is what we call it, proposal. It does this. So let's discuss some of the facts right now that we have 11 million unauthorized immigrants, and 3/4 of them work, and half of them work with other people's social security numbers, and half work in the cash economy. The solution, I think, could be that if our employees, the workers and their employers paid just a nickel for every dollar that they earned, over a 10-year period, we could create $210 billion and create 1.7 million American jobs. Let me ask you to look at your brochure here on the first page. We have a breakdown. Everybody have one of these? If you can see under education, there's $60 billion allocated, and some of my favorite points here of things that we can accomplish are food for children in school. Without this, children can't learn, and we can't have future contributions to society. The fifth one down is trade and technical career schools. We have millions, actually, of veterans that need to be retrained, and here we have billions of dollars to help them do this. Under the health care, the first two items deal with the ER issue, and we could fund medical clinics and urgent care to take the pressure off the ER, where it's a lot more expensive. We've allocated $10 billion for community centers, and fundamentally, this is where the immigrants can learn English as a second language. Nutritional guidance. In this country, the second largest group of diabetes is with Hispanic women. And here we can educate them and to reduce the cost of the health care in the United States. We discussed today several times the overburdened courts. Well, we could spend billions of dollars to help process this and help those seeking asylum to get into the country more quickly. Perhaps the most important one is the government service of the border security. The president has stated that he wants border security, and once he has this, he'll approve the DACA program. Well, here's a perfect way. If any of your congressmen know or speak to the president, you might mention that there is a way to get DACA, and best of all, that it's not paid for by ordinary Americans, but it's paid for Mexicans and other folks that have crossed the border illegally, and those people that hire them also illegally. And lastly, $60 billion for infrastructure, because we need interstate commerce to support our immigrants and businesses. I was amazed when I saw, I'm from California, I was just amazed what I saw on the East Coast, where you have secondary bridges underneath primary bridges to catch debris from falling down from bridges that are debilitated, not working, not functioning. Now, on the last page, which might be most interesting to all of you, are the state allocations. And if you could identify your state here, you can see how much revenue they get. California gets the lion's share of $44 billion, and which would help our Medi-Cal program, because that's how we fund immigrants right now, immigrant health care. The way to tax this without creating any kind of a bureaucracy is with the square and a credit card. It's a very simple application that could be created to do just that. It could be a very simple thing for the employer to be responsible for paying the 10% of the amount due from the employer and the worker. The way to encourage this action is to encourage the immigrants to participate here would be that with this, when they have their special permit, their 10-year special permit, a certain amount of benefits go with that. One is health care, and funds go to their children's schools. But probably the most important thing that could happen is they could have the right to travel back home and return safely. Many immigrants want to work here only a few years, but are incapable of going back home. They're not allowed to, and they're afraid to. Lots of second families are created just because of this problem. So we need a bill to be written, and our staff would be willing to work with anyone who wants to write the bill. The first Democrat and Republican will get naming rights to the bill.
I'm joined now by Clarissa Martinez de Castro from Unides US, formerly La Raza. I want to ask you, Clarissa, now to take me on a trip in the immigrant community, which you know, and tell me what it's like for somebody, one of the 11 million who lives in the shadows. What is that life like? What is the pressure? What is the sword dangling over their heads day after day? Maybe one member of the family has been in the US for 20 years and one is an American, and the children, they are Americans. What is it like with that pressure, that stain, that original kind of sin in a family?
I think that the important thing is to focus on what actually the majority, the overwhelming majority of Americans want, which is a solution. Folks do want our system of immigration to be orderly and for people to come through legal channels. And that's why I believe, poll after poll, for more than a decade, the vast majority of Americans support an immigration reform that creates a way for people who are currently in the country unauthorized to come forward, get right with the law, get with the books, and eventually earn their way to legality and to citizenship. I think that people are really focused on how do we solve this problem and how do we move forward. And that is one important thing not to lose sight. Interestingly, I think, as is often the case with many things, leaders, sometimes rather than lead, are trying to get direction from where the majority of people are The American people are ready to move forward on this issue, and it is about time for members of Congress to actually get with the program and with the majority of Americans.
But let me remind you that deportations are not unique to this administration. They were pretty intense under the Obama administration, and they weren't called out as strongly.
So I'll take a look way back and then to where we are today. It is fascinating that our country, that the United States is a land of immigrants, is a country of immigrants. It's been true throughout our history. And while we are proud of that legacy, it is also true that we have a very tortured history in that respect. This is a systemic problem, not an individual problem. And the long view sometimes can help us understand that there is a possibility of a solution. Our country has had a backlash against every group of immigrants in the past. We tend to romanticize that, but we have had a backlash against immigrants of German descent, Irish descent, Japanese, Chinese, Italian, you name it. Latinos are the majority of the current chapter of immigration in our country. And I am hopeful that as we did in the past, we will overcome it. My hope is that we would overcome it faster and with less wounds than we have done in the past. What it's like for people right now, it feels as if this administration is deciding to use its prosecutorial discretion in applying laws with extreme prejudice and malice, without regard to whether people are contributing or whether people are harming. In fact, we are seeing more people who are actually contributing and have no criminal records and who have families being persecuted. Unidos, formerly National Council of La Raza, called out President Obama for his record on deportations, as did many organizations in the civil rights space and in the immigrant rights space. There have been problems with the functioning of our immigration system for a very long time now, spanning at least 2 decades. We are in desperate need of modernizing that system. And while we haven't dealt with modernizing certain elements of that system, and they all work together like a clock, the place that we have continually put more and more resources is in enforcement measures that take a very punitive approach. So indeed, President Obama presided over an unprecedented number of deportations, which we and others called them on. And what we're seeing right now is not only that happening, but an incredible amount of demonizing and turbocharging the extreme prejudice in the exercise of deportation and tracking of immigrant populations.
What would you support? What would your organization support that was short of citizenship and amnesty? In fact, what was discussed here today is one such example, a third way, 5+5, which would at least relieve the burden on all these people living in the shadows, and maybe put it off for 10 or 20 years, because there would be a way to dignity in life, but not to citizenship, which so bothers the political establishment. How would you respond to what you've heard today and the idea of work permits without permanence?
There is a long trajectory of negotiating, so in good faith, sometimes not in good faith, on the issue of immigration. I think that's the reason we have seen legislation pass at different times in the past. It's been a result of negotiations and reaching agreement and compromise between a variety of interests. So I don't think that what's missing is a proposal. Visa portability, the rights of workers, the fixing of the legal immigration system, the what do we do with immigrants who are here, those are all elements that have been part of the discussion. I think that one of the issues we are facing is the ability of a few members of Congress to dominate the discussion, members who are not interested in providing a solution. So I would say that the biggest impediment is the perceived political gain those members seek to extract from impeding progress and from being out of tune where the majority of Americans are.
Somebody who's reported on this pretty solidly for the last 5 years, done many broadcast articles, etc. It does seem to me that if you have a single concrete proposal it is with a single concrete idea that anything is moved forward.
If you look at the history of this issue, right, we have, again, it's not the lack of willingness to negotiate or compromise. That's how the different pieces of legislation that have moved forward have happened, including proposals that include something we're very interested in, which is protecting the rights of workers here and the right of workers that will come. Again, the issue is to create an environment where a few politicians who have no interest in solving this are not the ones who have been given the reins of leading the debate.
As a journalist, I can tell you that when I go and talk to a member of Congress, and I do that a lot, and I say something specific, they say, oh, I like that, I can follow that. And when it's general, they tend to hide behind the talking points of their party or their caucus, whatever it is. So this is an interesting discussion. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And really appreciate it. Good luck. As one immigrant to another, good luck in this great challenge.
As an American to another, good luck to us all.
As an American,
That's
good luck
right.
to us all. We pause now for station identification, particularly for our listeners on Sirius XM Radio, channel 124, the POTUS channel, where the audio from White House Chronicle, which our listeners are indeed listening to this very minute, White House Chronicle is coming to you today from the capital of the United States, where we are attending a special briefing on immigration and the uses of taxes in solving the immigration problem. This program can be seen on 200 American television stations and can be heard and seen around the world on the broadcast outlets of the Voice of America. And we're very proud to say that the Voice of America is now translating the program into Chinese.
This is a broad topic relating to the aspects of immigration reform, and I'm sure any of us could easily deliver like a 2-hour lecture on every subpoint. But I will have mercy on you this afternoon and just try to keep my comments brief. I want to start with just some broad general principles that I think we need to approach this problem with, and then talk about 5 kind of substantive areas that I think should be included in any conversation relating to immigration reform. So let me start with the general principles. First general principle is that we need to approach this conversation in a data-driven way. I think my co-panelists have already mentioned kind of the way in which rhetoric, and the way I like to think about it is anecdotes, tend to take precedence in the debate over actual data about the impact of immigrants, their importance to the economy, their integration into the economy, et cetera. So I think it's important that we rely on research that's been done in making the decision and not be swayed too easily by the individualized anecdotes that get propagated in the media. The second is that we need to have a cohesive approach to immigration reform. And what do I mean by that? When we think about immigration policy, there's so many different aspects of it that sometimes they're operating at cross purposes. So one aspect of immigration policy, at least over the last 20 years or so, has been as a tool relating to national security and border control, right? So immigration law operates in part to ensure that the United States is safe. And as a consequence of that, it's resulting in expulsions and limitations in terms of who can enter the country. Another aspect of immigration law, however, is ensuring that there is a labor force that's needed, right? And you can see how sometimes these different aspects of the law operate in tension, right? Well, on the one hand, we're trying to get rid of people, keep people out in an effort to ensure the security of the country, but on the other hand, we need to bring people in order to support the economy. And there's ways in which they can be reconciled, but we need to have a forum and a space in which we're talking about the different objectives that are being served by immigration law that are sometimes at cross purposes. The third general principle is looking at this as a regional and a global challenge. All too often in the history of US immigration policy, we've thought about this as an individualized issue. It's all about US interests without really thinking about the regional and global implications of our policy decisions. So perfect example. Right now, our president and the Mexican president are engaged in a tete-a-tete on Twitter. I don't know if you saw the tweets earlier today. And there's kind of this, ¿quién es más macho thing happening between the two presidents around immigration policy. But we need to cooperate with Mexico, not just on the issue of Mexican migration, because Mexican migration is now a net negative to the United States. We need to cooperate around Central American migration, right? What is the regional strategy? That is the most significant migration-related challenge the U.S. has right now, which is Central American migration and how to deal with that humanitarian crisis. And Mexico is a critical partner in that. And so we need to be thinking about this as a regional and even indeed a global issue. Another example is Haiti, right? Post-earthquake in 2010, different countries have adopted different approaches to dealing with outflows of Haitian migrants. But there hasn't been a cohesive regional strategy, and the US's recent decision to cut off TPS hasn't been made in consultation with other regional partners. So those are some general principles I think that we want to approach the conversation with, and just to get into, as I mentioned, 5 aspects that I think should be kind of front and center in our discussions. First, of course, anyone who talks about immigration reform is going to talk about some kind of what I call regularization. Other people will say legalization, other people will say amnesty. The point is that we're talking about some process by which persons who lack permanent lawful status or any lawful status can move into some kind of lawful permanent residence. Why is that important? Because, of course, we have a significant need for these individuals in our economy. Many of them are already integrated into our economy and job market. There's consistent research on the positive tax and Social Security benefits to a regularization. And there are millions and millions of Americans who are living in mixed status families. So these individuals are already socially integrated into our communities and families, and it only makes sense from a humanitarian standpoint that we move towards some kind of regularization. The second piece that I'll mention is economics, right? Of course, we want to think about immigration reform in a way that's going to be overall beneficial to the U.S. economy. And there are tons of research studies about the impact of immigration and immigrants on the U.S. economy. And of course, you can find a study that will support any position that you want to take. But if you look at the overall body of research, there are a couple of general principles that one can discern. The first is that immigrants tend to have a net marginal positive wage effect on U.S. workers. What that means is that the presence of immigrants benefits the wages of U.S. workers a little bit. Not massively, but over time there's a net marginal positive impact. The second is that, yes, of course, there are some short-term displacements of U.S. workers in particular industries and certain geographic areas. That's undisputed, but that, again, over time, U.S. workers, because they are sometimes pushed into higher skilled work and other types of positions, see a net positive benefit impact by the presence of immigrants. The third is that the persons who are most likely to be affected by immigrant workers are prior immigrants themselves, prior generations of immigrants. And the fourth is that immigrants consistently have higher rates of self-employment. They're more entrepreneurial, they're starting businesses in larger numbers than US-born individuals. And so in this economic space, there's a lot of areas for improvement around the visa system, what was already mentioned around our guest worker programs. The other thing I'll mention that is consistent with the economic piece, my colleague mentioned the problem that we have where we have all these foreign students in the United States, right? But we don't have pathways for them to eventually get permanent jobs in the United States because of the competition for visas. There's another trend that we should all be aware of, which is the decrease in enrollment of international students at US universities. In fall of 2017, some of the data that's starting to come out is showing a decrease of between 4 to 7% in enrollment. There was also a decrease in fall in 2016, but it looks like it's increasing, right, the overall drop. Why does that matter? Because of course public universities and private universities are critical for the economy. And why is this happening? Well, there's lots of reasons, but part of it is because there is more competition from overseas programs, Canada and Europe, that are competing for the students, but also a lot of it is because of the environment, anti-immigrant hostility that we're seeing in the United States. Students just don't want to come here because some of them simply don't feel safe. Third area relates to backlogs and efficiencies. So as an immigration lawyer, I think many of us who know the field know that the backlogs are enormous, right? You could wait 20 years for a family-based visa. But we should also be thinking about backlogs in the context of immigration court. Recently went to court on behalf of a client, and we were given a court date for 2021. So not a particularly efficient system that we have, enormous backlogs, and the solution to that is not necessarily just to remove due process and just move things more quickly, but we do need more immigration judges. And we also need more efficient practices. I think Clarissa was mentioning, the immigration system was founded in, a kind of a pre-high-tech system. And so in immigration court right now, there's no e-filing. Most courts around the country have e-filing. In the immigration court system, if I want to file an asylum brief, which has like 500 pages, I literally have to deliver a physical copy. Highly inefficient, resource intensive, and there's much more expedient ways in which we can be approaching the adjudication problem. Fourth point relates to national security and immigration enforcement. Of course, national security is an important part of immigration reform, and we have consistently invested significant resources in terms of border control and enhancing national security. The most recent executive orders also talk about national security, so that's continuing to be a part of it. But we also have to look at whether or not we're going too far in terms of enforcement. And as has been mentioned, as it stands right now, there are no meaningful enforcement priorities, right? Under prior administrations, there have been priorities in terms of who is susceptible to removal. But what's happened under the current administration is essentially an elimination of the idea of prosecutorial discretion. We all know that in the criminal justice context, right, a prosecutor can decide, this was the first-time offense, or it's relatively low level, we're just going to set it aside and not prosecute it. That culture existed to some extent under the Bush administration and grew substantially under the Obama administration, and now it's essentially been jettisoned. And that's creating contributing to the backlogs, that literally every person who's apprehended is put into the full force of the removal system. And that it doesn't have to be that way. The last point I'll make relates to humanitarian migration. I encourage all of you to pay close attention to what's happening to the US asylum system. There have been a number of cases that have been where the Attorney General has certified them to himself. For example, a case that is poised to strip the ability of domestic violence survivors from getting asylum. Many of these cases that the Attorney General has decided that he wants to redecide for himself will become binding precedent on US immigration judges and the Board of Immigration Appeals, and will transform the availability of humanitarian protection for people who are coming to the United States. Temporary protected status has come under attack. You can critique kind of the long duration of some of these TPS grants, but there's really no logic to some of the decisions that are being made, and it goes to my earlier point of ensuring that our decisions are not only data-driven, but also consistent with what's happening regionally and internationally.
That is our show for today. We're so glad you came along. We hope that you have new ways of thinking about immigration, about the human cost of immigration, and the solutions which might be right at hand, right in front of us, and oddly, through that most displeasing thing, taxation. See you next week when we will continue this conversation. Cheers.